I'm Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief of USA Today, and this is Capitol Download. We're in the offices of Lonnie Bunch, founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, my pleasure.
The Smithsonian's newest museum is going to open in September. Are you ready?
On September 24th, we will be. The challenge is that at this stage, so much of the big work is done, the building, but now it's the logistics.
When people walk into this museum, what are some of the big things that they're going to see?
Well, I think that when people walk in, the goal of the museum really is for people to walk out changed. And so in a way, they'll get to see some amazing artifacts that I'm stunned that we had. On the one hand, you'll see things that I didn't know existed, like, oh, Nat Turner's Bible, or a hymnal that Harriet Tubman carried with her. Or you'll see pieces from a slave ship that we brought up from off the coast of South Africa. But you also see things that'll make you smile. You'll see Chuck Berry's guitar, or you'll see the mothership from George Clinton, or you'll see beautiful quilts that'll make you realize the creativity that was at the heart of this community.
You, of course, are a student of African American history, but is there an object that you've gotten for this museum that is particularly meaningful to you, that touched you?
I think every day, right, a different object touches me, but right now I am still overwhelmed by the piece of wood that we brought up from a slave ship off the coast of South Africa. The tribal chieftain from that community told me that when you go back to where that ship is, if you could take soil from Mozambique, where most of the people came from, and if you could sprinkle that soil over the ship, then for the first time since 1794, our people will sleep in their own land. And that, to me, was so powerful. So now, when I look at that...
So did you do that?
I did. We sprinkled the soil over the ship, and we really felt the power of both ancestors and the power of helping people understand a big story, a horrific story, by looking at a piece of wood that was touched and stepped on by the enslaved.
Of course, the debate about race in this country isn't history alone. It's the present day as well. What will you do about, for instance, Black Lives Matter in the museum?
It's crucial to us to help people realize that history is not nostalgia. History is this amazing tool that helps people live their lives, to understand the challenges they face. So when we look at things like Black Lives Matter, it was crucially important for us to interview people involved, to go to Baltimore and interview people around the crisis there, to begin to collect artifacts, shirts that say Black Lives Matters, or the posters that people carried, because it is important on a couple levels. One is part of the job of any museum is to anticipate what historians would want to know 50 years from now. So that's part of the job, is to say, we think this is important. But the other part of it is to recognize that if you want to be a place of value, a place of meaning, you've got to let people use the past to understand better the present, and then to use history to realize that there have always been moments of Black Lives Matter, that there have been opportunities for people to come together to right a wrong, to transform the country. So not that people think that Black Lives Matter is something that happened in isolation, but it's part of a long tradition of helping to make America better.
When you look at the arc of African American history in this country, where does Black Lives Matter fit in that?
I think in some ways you could argue that almost every generation within this period of history has said, how do we help America live up to its stated ideals? Some say it was the abolitionist movement to end slavery. Others could look at the sort of early women's organization in the early 20th century that demanded equality for men, for black men and for women. But I think Black Lives Matters in some ways, it's not, as they say, your grandmother's civil rights movement. But what it is a moment that says, how do we take advantage of technology? How do we take advantage of people's interest? How do we take advantage of the media to affect change? So in some ways, Black Lives Matter is a part of a long tradition of saying we can perfect America if we're willing to challenge America.
You grew up in New Jersey?
In New Jersey.
Were you touched by the civil rights struggle that was going on mostly in the South then?
I think that, like many people, we watched it, over dinner at night, beginning to talk about what this means. But because my mother's family is from the South, we would go to the South several times a year. And, I can remember sort of that sense of dread. Part of it was that I didn't know who Emmett Till was, the young person who was killed, when I was 2 years old as a teenager from Chicago going to the South. But we always knew that as a cautionary tale. We knew that something had happened to northern teenagers going south. So my parents would talk a lot about what it's like in the South and what you could expect. And I can remember, like it was yesterday, driving with my parents going to North Carolina, and my mother didn't drive in those days. My father was driving, and I remember he got tired, and he pulled off into what we would now call a sort of motel. And I remember that he got out to smoke a cigarette. And suddenly I looked up. My brother was asleep, my mother was asleep, and he was standing under a sign that said white only. And I remember being terrified, thinking, oh God, something's going to happen. And I remember he was just calmly smoking a cigarette, and I'm in the back seat going, let's get out of here, this is ridiculous. And I remember when he gets back into the car, he sees that I'm kind of agitated. And he said, I'll never forget, he said, this is my America too. So I have a right to be everywhere. And in a way, those kinds of moments, very small, stuck with me in terms of sort of expecting something from America, then expecting people to help America live up to its ideal.
You have 2 millennial daughters. Do they look at race in a different way than you do?
I would say that millennials look at race, on the one hand, very differently, as something that's much more fluid, that isn't as rigid a boundary as it was when I was growing up. But on the other hand, what I found is that they also recognize that race still matters. And so what they do is they don't find themselves sort of reacting to race as the first cause, as I might have done. But they still recognize that race is such an important factor that shapes opportunities and expectations. And where they come on, what I think is very powerful, is that they believe that you can overcome that. That the challenge is to shine the light on it, to confront it. Whereas many people of my generation really didn't believe you'd ever be able to overcome it.
Lonnie Bunch, thanks for joining us on Capitol Download.
My pleasure. Thank you.